Here is video 2 for the first unit of human geography, and this time we're going to be talking about the 5 themes of geography. So we worked a little bit about the 5 themes in class. You guys answered some questions about the 5 themes, and also, of course, hopefully you've looked at the slideshow, but let me walk you through each of the 5 themes really briefly. First, we have location, human environment interaction, regions, place, and movement. These 5 themes are kind of interchangeable. Location is almost always the one that geographers use first, but for the others, they're kind of interchangeable in the sense that you could say location, place, region, movement, human environment interaction. Nobody's really going to call you out on the fact that you use one before the other. As long as you know the 5, you're doing really well. Long time ago, geographers used to have these 4 geographical traditions by a guy named Pattison. Those became out of vogue. Nowadays, the new geography standards from the National Geographic Society talk about the 6 essential elements of geography. And they are trying to replace those 5 themes, but generally speaking, the 5 themes are still pretty much the gold standard for how geographers think and how they do their practice. And again, here's a little visual of the 5 themes. Those 6 essential elements that I just mentioned, they want to look at the world in spatial terms. If you remember from the last video, spatial and geographical are essentially just interchangeable terms. So we're always looking at spatial patterns. Places and regions. You'll notice that those are 2 of the 5 themes. So we talk about the identities of the people who live in a particular part of the world. Can we look at common characteristics? Because all regions have common characteristics. When you look at physical systems and human systems, 3 and 4, again, isn't that just kind of a cleverly reworked human environment interaction? And after all, number 5, environment and society, that's almost exactly like human environment interaction. 6 is kind of interesting though. It's talking about the uses of geography. How is this going to be relatable? How is this going to be relevant? How is this going to help you make more money in the future? Believe me, almost every company in America right now wants to hire people who can mine geospatial data and help a company make use out of that data to help them decide about their suppliers, their transporters, their retailers, the goods and the services that they provide, and understanding how, in a world of scarce resources and ever-going climate change, they can continuously adapt and prepare for the economy of the future. So we talk about that first theme, location. You sometimes see realtors talk about the 3 key factors in when you build a house or buy a house. And they always say it's location, location, location. For example, the 3 pigs. It doesn't matter if you build your house out of straw or wood or bricks. If you're a pig and you're building your house right next to a sausage factory, something tells me your tenure in that place is going to be pretty short. So location can be absolute or it can be relative. Absolute location has to have a specific quantifiable number associated with it, like latitude and longitude coordinates or an address. Relative location is always going to be based off of some other location. Human environment interaction. This one's probably the most self-explanatory of all the 5 themes. How do we change the environment that we live in? And how does the environment affect the culture of where we live, the way of life that we're able to practice? Sometimes you'll see this called cultural ecology. 2 key terms that are in your vocab list that talk about human environment interaction. Does the environment determine our way of life? Or are humans, because of technology, able to overcome the limitations of their environment? And is the environment merely a limiting factor and not necessarily the overriding factor in how they live their lives? And that's essentially the difference between determinist and possibilist thinking. In our class, we're going to talk a lot about how humans interact with their surrounding environment and nature. Obviously, population growth is a big issue. You live in a world of 7.5 billion people. When I was born, the world was barely 4 billion people. By the time your children are born, the earth could be nearly 10 billion people. How is that going to affect water? How is that going to affect agriculture and the ability to feed the world? As more and more people leave rural places and move into cities, how many more resources are going to be needed in order to live in urban areas? How much electricity will have to be generated? How will that affect climate change? How does communication and transportation connectivity and the energy that it requires affecting how we're living our lives? So our relationship with nature and the human condition is definitely a connected world. Think about New Orleans. This is a picture of New Orleans pre-Katrina. And if you want to look up Hurricane Katrina, you'll find some interesting relevant articles and pictures about how the city of New Orleans was built in a bowl a long time ago, 300 years ago by the French. The Mississippi River on one side, Lake Pontchartrain on the other side. A big, massive system of dikes and levees supposedly preventing the city from flooding. Especially look at the bottom of the picture. A lot of that is public housing right near the downtown area, within walkable distance of jobs for the low-income people that live there. But notice that that area was incredibly vulnerable. Look what happens post-Katrina. Again, look at the apartments in the foreground at the bottom of your screen, just below the interstate that cuts through the city. The Superdome dominant right there in the center of the screen. And look how much of the city was absolutely inundated by the storm surge and by the torrential rains that came with the hurricane. Disproportionately, people of low-income areas were harder hit than the wealthier people who live further out in the suburban fringes and the edge cities of the area of New Orleans. So again, this is all human environment interaction, where we choose to build our cities, how we choose to build our cities, and how we choose to deal with the challenges of climate change. Regions. All regions have common characteristics. It's one simple way to remember that we can lump things together by regional analysis. But regions can be three different kinds of regions. They can be formal, they can be functional, they can be perceptual. Each of the three has an AKA that you probably should know. Formal regions are sometimes called uniform. When people are in uniform, they look the same. So a formal region has some sort of common human or physical characteristic. If you're in Quebec, the common human characteristic is you're going to hear French. How do you know you're not in Quebec anymore? Well, you don't hear French anymore. A functional region is sometimes called a nodal region. A node is a network or the center point of a network. Think about a computer network. Functional regions are where you have an activity or some sort of linkage between spatial interactions around that focal point. Functional regions are oftentimes based on things like commuting, or it might even be a congressional district. That would be a functional region. Perceptual regions. These are sometimes called vernacular, and these are the ones that exist in people's minds. If I asked you to identify the South, there's a lot of ways we could define the South. Is it states that used to be Confederate states? Are they the states that were slave owning? Are they states where the winter is mild? Are they states where people speak like I do when you sometimes hear my Tennessee accent come out? These perceptual regions will be fuzzy because everybody will define them slightly differently, but they will be using some sort of common characteristic, even if they don't map those areas exactly the same. So when you think about regions, and this is a good map showing you the United States and the degree of educational attainment by state, you can see that the Northeast has much higher educational attainment than, say, the Deep South. The Western states generally higher than, say, the Great Plains. And this sometimes is really interesting to look at if you were to compare a map like this with a map, say, of the average income by state. The states that have greater educational attainment also have higher incomes. Probably no shock to you there. Things like time zones. These are places that are functional regions as well. A functional region, again, is an activity. Oftentimes, travelers use these time zones when they make long business trips. This is something we talk about, jet lag. Companies will sometimes use the idea of time zones when they're talking about logistics. So time zones are something that really came into vogue in the late 1800s to help travelers. because as transportation became faster and more useful, and people could move greater distances in less time, it became more important to understand that time is a relative thing. For example, Russia has 11 time zones. It's dark at one end of Russia when it's light at the other end. In China, everybody's on Beijing time. Some countries like Myanmar, they want to be on their own time zone. So they actually go on the half hour instead of being 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock. If you look at the map, you can see that in that area of Myanmar, they sometimes operate on the half hour. Another idea of the functional region, again, talking about commuting zones. Commuting zones are when people are going to be moving in and out of the suburban areas, going downtown for work. Some of your parents may do this by going to Fort Lauderdale or West Palm Beach. Perceptual regions, again, in people's minds. So you look at something like the South, the West, the Pacific Northwest, New England. Sometimes these are perceptual regions of North America. In your College Board course and exam description, they think that you should have a pretty good idea of how to lump the world into regions. So sometimes you'll see different places like West Africa, South Asia, maybe the area of Latin America. So make sure you take a quick look at this chart and understand how they sometimes lump together areas of the world that have similar or common characteristics, even if they're not the same. Place is one of those 5 themes that looks at the distinguishing human and physical characteristics. Sometimes by looking at the GeoGuessr game, you start to get a sense of place. What's the quality of life like where people live? Is it low income? Is it high income? Is it a particular climate zone? Sometimes in America, suburban places have become so standardized and not unique at all that we sometimes use the word placelessness. Sometimes when you go into a mall, if I were to spin you around and open your eyes and tell me what mall are you in just based on the different stores, you'd say, well, gee, I don't know. Because once you start getting inside of a mall, almost all the stores start to look the same. Cultural landscape. This is another example of place characteristics. How have humans changed the landscape? What's the built environment like? Not the physical, not the natural, but what people have done to change that environment. Part of this, of course, is through your culture, your way of life. So movement is another of the 5 themes. This is going to be the one where we talk about people moving with migration, imports and exports of products, the spread of ideas like language or religion or political systems of government. And it always is going to be based on accessibility and connectivity. This is why I want you to be on Google Classroom. This is why I want you to be on Remind, because we would have accessibility and connectivity. And the only way that there's going to be the exchange of ideas is through that platform of communication. So human geography is all about relationships, interconnections, different places, interacting with commodities, services, information, the global economy, and of course, distance matters. Right? Tobler's first law of geography. Everything's related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. And it's really true. Look at the plastic pollution in the world. 95% of all the plastic that goes into the oceans comes from just a few places in the world. And almost all of those places are in only really 2 regions of the world. Asia, particularly East and South East Asia, as well as South Asia, which is India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. But you also see that the Nile and the Niger River in Africa. So what's interesting about this is 95% of the plastic going in the ocean is only coming from these low-income developing areas of the world, but yet we don't want to have plastic straws at restaurants in Boca Raton. How much of an impact are we really making by boycotting these plastic straws? Then you look at movement, for example, in Major League Baseball. Here's all the Major League Baseball teams in the United States in 1952. Now, again, even Spatial Shark wasn't alive in 1952. But look at the system of baseball as the expansion teams came in. A lot of teams moved to the West Coast to take advantage of the increasing population in places like California. Teams moved into Florida and Texas. Again, big states with growing populations as people from the Northeast and the Midwest started moving south and west to find better climates and new job opportunities. Well, baseball teams need to put people in the seats. So instead of continuing to exist in old stadiums that were kind of falling apart in the old cities of the Northeast and the Midwest, some of them moved to places like Los Angeles, right? The Dodgers moving out of Brooklyn. Or you see things like expansion teams, the Florida Marlins, right? Where it was a new team that came to the new market of Miami. Somebody like the Braves, right? Started as the Boston Braves, then they were the Milwaukee Braves, and then they became the Atlanta Braves. And look how dominant their market area is. There's no team really anywhere close to the Braves, which is why a lot of times you find, even in Florida, a lot of people will tell you their favorite team is the Braves. Or they could be transplants, and they'll tell you that they still follow the Phillies, or they're Mets fans, or especially Red Sox and Yankees fans. That's it for slideshow 2. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to leave some comments. Tell me how I can get better.